By the way, my name's Doug French, if anybody knows or cares. I've been around all weekend, fielding your complaints about the temperature. I know you're either cold or hot. I don't know which it is, but it's almost over. It is my distinct pleasure to award this year's O.P. Alford III Prize for Libertarian Scholarship. And I wanted to say a little bit about Mr. Alford, who I didn't know. He worked at the Institute before my time. He first became acquainted with the Institute back in 1984, and actually for the last 5 years of his life, before he died at age 91, he actually worked full-time at the Institute, stuffing envelopes, doing anything that he could to advance the cause of liberty. And this was after a life of working very hard. He worked as a sea captain, a mechanic, a tugboat captain. He was a grain and dairy farmer. But I think what's very interesting about him, and I hear stories about him occasionally around the Institute, is that he lived in a trailer outside of town, even though he was quite successful and quite wealthy, which told me immediately that he was single. He lived his life alone. No woman would have let him get away with that. But he was very good to the Institute, and we honor him with this prize. We've made it an annual prize. It used to be every other year, but we're going to do this prize every year now. And just to know where these papers come from that we are going to honor, they come from Libertarian Papers, which was founded a year ago and replaces the Journal of Libertarian Studies, essentially. And a great man, Stephan Kinsella, is running this operation and has done an incredible job at it. So 44 articles were published in Libertarian Papers in 2009. And I really think it's the template for what academic journals are going to be in the future. So the first paper to be honored from this Libertarian Papers group was a paper on the pioneering effort to advance the theory of the private production of justice. And I think we all know who that is. It's a gentleman who's, well, he's been hanging around the conference all week. I think he's presented 2 papers. He's chaired another session, but his partner in crime, so to speak, isn't here. But Gil Guillory is here, and I would like him to come forward. You want to say anything? There's money in there. It's not real money.
Drinks are, no, I shouldn't say that.
The check will clear.
I'm speechless. I don't know what to say.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Well, when you render Gil Guillory speechless, you've done something. So anyway, I urge all of you to continue your scholarship. We're going to award this prize every year. We're also going to award the Lawrence Fertig Prize in Austrian scholarship every year. We're not doing it this year, but we're going to get on track to award both of these prizes. They carry $1,000 prizes, and I urge all of you to pursue that. So, next up, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker.
There's no reason to clap for the guy introducing the real star. This is my second opportunity to do this. I'm excited about it. The lecture is, of course, Paul Cantor, and it's something we've all looked forward to. The book in question is this one, Literature and the Economics of Liberty, which came out only earlier this year. An interesting little publication history behind this book. When the PDF arrived of the guts of the book, we were so excited about it that we went ahead and posted the whole thing online, unheard of in the academic publishing world. So it was available to everyone. And then about 10 days later, we put out the Kindle edition. So it was for sale on Amazon. So already the authors of the papers and the editors were receiving emails commenting about their book. And Paul Cantor wrote me, he said, is this book ever going to exist in the physical world? But what was it, about a month later or something, it did come to exist in the physical world, and we have copies downstairs. Very, very beautiful book, and I'm pleased to say that both the editors, Stephen Cox and Paul Cantor, have reported receiving many compliments about the look and feel of the book. But what's most exciting is what's inside of it. It's a book that was really 18 years in the making. It began in 1992 at the first Austrian Scholars Conference in New York, right, yeah. And Paul Cantor came and gave a paper, and the paper was on Thomas Mann and the implications of one of his short stories for the theory of and practice of inflation and how it affects society. And I remember sitting out there in the audience for that and thinking, this is a remarkable moment. We're seeing something completely new here. We're seeing Austrian economics applied to a sector of knowledge that it's never really been applied to before. And Murray Rothbard, as I recall, was beside himself with glee about this paper in particular, and also about the implications of this field of research. So that was all those many years ago. And here now we see that one paper that was delivered in 1992 spawned an entire new field of research that's inspired many other scholars. They've all contributed to this book, and the results are in front of us today. The first of what I hope is going to be many efforts in this direction. I remember as an undergraduate reading Human Action, and Mises would frequently use this sentence. He says, praxeology and its heretofore most elaborated application of economics. You remember reading this many times in his work, and the first thing that occurs to you is you think, well, what else does it apply to besides economics, really? And what's taking everybody so long to get to these other applications? Well, this is an example of an application of praxeology that goes beyond economics, or in addition to economics, literary criticism. And I'm thrilled to be living in times where we see this coming to life for the first time. He's done for literary criticism in many ways what Rothbard did for politics, is to apply Misesian logic to a completely new field. He's provided both new methods for interpreting literature and new names and figures to admire and learn from. So much of our own understanding of our intellectual history is derived from that given to us by Hayek and Mises and Rothbard. And what Cantor has done is blown open a whole new sector for us and given us all sorts of new heroes, people to learn from: Shelley, Cather, Conrad, Thomas Mann, so many others. They appear in here. And we're already busy making T-shirts of all of these individuals, by the way. Of course, that's always the second step, right? Right. In some ways, though, it is a follow-up on an older project, one begun by Henry Hazlitt, as a matter of fact. He was a literary critic long before he became an economist. He worked for The Nation magazine, writing literary criticism. And in fact, he wrote a book on the topic of literary criticism that integrated questions of economic theory into literary criticism. It's called something. Anatomy of Criticism, a Trialogue, something like that. It's a very interesting book, extremely rare until a couple of years ago when we brought it out in our series of books. So in some ways, I think we can say that Paul Cantor is, in this respect, a Haslittian. But who is Paul Cantor? He's a professor of literature at the University of Virginia, author of several books on both what you consider high scholarship of Shakespeare, but also application of literary criticism to popular culture. and he's sort of famous for doing this. We're fortunate that as a very young man, he studied himself under Mises and Mises' seminar, and carried the legacy with him his entire life. And it shows how the effects of one person can have long past his death. So here Mises lives on in the work of Cantor and in Cantor's students. Incredible. He, some years ago, came to the Mises Institute and gave a week-long series of lectures on the history of culture. And I think there were a total of 10 lectures. Those lectures are now part of iTunes University, and they are among the most popular. We have about 175,000 or so downloads from iTunes University every week. And iTunes U is constantly featuring Paul Cantor's series on culture and capitalism up at the top of the page. If you go there, you can see it. So he's definitely another superstar in our midst, one with a personal lineage that traces back to Mises. So he has a special honored place in our hearts. And I give you Professor Paul Cantor.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I should say that my co-editor, Stephen Cox, sends his regrets. He has something of an administrative position at the University of California at San Diego and is currently involved in the budget cuts in his state. I was told they now just have to find $20 billion more to cut, and they'll be fine. So I understand why he is busy at the moment, and Dario Fernandez Moreira had hoped to be here, one of the authors in the book, but he had to go to Guatemala. So either I have my priorities right or I just got nothing better to do. But anyway, I'm here and we'll try to represent the whole book for you. This is really the appropriate place to talk about this book. This book really does arise out of the Mises Institute. More than half the essays were presented here as papers at one time or another. As Jeff pointed out, it all began with the essay contest that was really sponsored by the 10th anniversary Mises Institute occasion. And I had this lecture I'd been giving on Thomas Mann, decided I'd submit that, and it was chosen, and the rest is history. I gave the Ludwig von Mises lecture 1 year, and that has become the first chapter in the book, and Chandran Kukathis, who contributed, gave the Hayek lecture 1 year. So this book is deeply steeped in the Mises Institute, and we're all very grateful for all the assistance over the years and for the absolutely beautiful job that was done with the book. To say a few words about my own career, I genuinely am an English professor. I have a PhD in English. I know how to scan poetry. Da 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 da. That's iambic pentameter. But in my youth, I was very much interested in economics. Was very fortunate to attend Mises' seminar, 1961 to 1962. It really was a difficult decision for me to go into English and not into economics. And I will say, it's not that I loved Mises less; it's that I love Shakespeare more. It really took someone as titanic as Shakespeare to win me away from economics. And I was so happy when decades later I figured out how to combine the two loves of my life, economics, Austrian economics and literature. And so maybe it all worked out well in the end, because we have been able to open up a new front in this book. Let me stress that this book is not the be-all and the end-all in literary theory. We were not out to transform the whole of literary theory, and we recognize people can still go count syllables and study iambic pentameter, and there's lots of useful ways to talk about literature that don't involve economics. What we did set out to do in this book is to counter the really unhealthy trend in literary criticism that insofar as it does deal with economics, it does so ignorantly, which is to say in a Marxist fashion. That is, whether it's outright Marxist Marxism or quasi-Marxism or pseudo-Marxism, when my colleagues decide to talk about literature and economics, it's always from a Marxist perspective. Now, there's all sorts of theoretical ramifications for that, but I want to cut to the chase and look at the fundamental ways in which the study of literature and economics has been Marxist. First of all, literary critics will seek out any way they can to find criticisms of capitalism in literature and celebrations of various forms of collectivism, including specifically Marxist ones. Unfortunately, that's not a difficult chance for them. Not a difficult task for them, because a lot of authors have been sympathetic to various forms of collectivism and hostile to free markets. I'll actually go into some reasons for that, and several of the essays in this book attempt to deal with just that issue. So you get a great deal of discussions of ways in which literature exposes the horrors of capitalism, and sometimes the way it celebrates life on the good old collective farm. When literary critics of this type find an author who somehow celebrates free markets or capitalism, that's false consciousness. Those authors are accused of being the dupes of capitalism, and a great deal of this brand of economic criticism of literature deals with how the market ensnares authors and how they become a spokesman for the capitalist system, and all these arguments about class consciousness. And so it is a great deal of this kind of literary criticism deals with that aspect. And then beyond that, to the extent that these critics or analysts look at the origins of literature in the real world, the material conditions behind the production of literature, they find that as one more aspect of how bad capitalism is. And so you find endless studies of how the capitalist system has corrupted literature. These usually deal with literature dealing from the 19th century on, but sometimes earlier. Endless complaints about the literary industry, about publishers, about all the apparatus, booksellers, whatever, book advertising, and so on, and unending arguments about how commerce corrupts culture. And these critics can find nothing good to be said for the way in which the market treats literature or contributes to its production. You might think people would acknowledge the fact that the free market has delivered books in numbers unheard of in the history of humanity and brought culture to vast numbers of people in a way that never been possible before. But no, that's just the mass production of literature, the commodification of culture. This is the sort of thing that my colleagues inveigh against. Well, this is what we set out to overturn. That may be a little too optimistic a term, but to at least argue against in our work. And as a result, I'll just in some ways just give you a sense of what is in this book. One of the things that attracted our attention is writers who have celebrated free markets. And there are many of them. I think one of the most interesting essays in the book is Dario Fernandez Morera's essay on Don Quixote, where he shows the spirit of freedom in Cervantes. Cervantes, who himself was a victim of various governments. He was imprisoned by foreign governments and by his own government. And Dario shows all sorts of ways in which Don Quixote celebrates market activity. One of the most interesting aspects of that essay is, of course, that Cervantes wrote before Adam Smith. And so Dario's essay is an excellent contribution to that program that Murray Rothbard and others have pursued of showing that Smith didn't invent capitalism and wasn't the first person to theorize free markets. In fact, Dario turns to the very Spanish scholastics that Rothbard was interested in, and that's a very interesting essay in showing how, again, long before the Scottish Enlightenment, there were thinkers in Spain who were analyzing economic phenomena in a kind of free market way. I contributed an essay on a play by Ben Jonson called Bartholomew Fair, which I argue is the first defense of free markets in English literary history, and so on down the line. Steve Cox has an excellent essay on Willa Cather, which in particular shows why a woman author would be particularly sympathetic to free markets, and how in her book, O Pioneers, the labor theory of value turns out to be the way the heroine's brothers oppress her. You know, they're doing all the physical labor on the farm. They therefore claim they should get all the credit. And that Marxist argument turns out to be anti-female because she's the smart one in the group and knows how to run the farm and understands she's contributing more value than they do, even though her physical labor is less. Chandran Kukathis contributes an essay on the Nigerian author Ben Okri, which shows here in a kind of post-colonial context, we have an author celebrating free markets and so on down the line. So I think we've done a good job in showing that literature is not necessarily anti-market in its attitudes. We also then turn the tables on these Marxist arguments for the false consciousness of authors who support capitalism. And Steve Cox and I have essays that analyze the false consciousness of left-wing authors, and showing that they are as much captive of their class position as any pro-capitalist has ever been. One of Steve's essays is on Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent. That's really one of the greatest novels of the 20th century and truly prophetic. It's hard to believe how prescient it was. It's a novel about what appears to be a left-wing anarchist socialist plot to blow up the Greenwich Observatory and create an international incident. It turns out that this terrorist plot is sponsored by a foreign right-wing government in England, which is trying to get England to clamp down on all the political exiles that England had been giving safe harbor to. And the amazing thing about the book is it shows that the extreme left and the extreme right are the same. They both hate capitalism. They both hate freedom. They both hate any form of contingency in life. The plot is to blow up the Greenwich Observatory, which is where the prime meridian is, Greenwich Mean Time. And Steve makes the brilliant observation in this book is that both the right, the extreme right and left, want to blow up time. Exactly what we understand from Austrian economics. Austrian economics, which is all about time and uncertainty. And various collectivist forms of economics, they feel they can eliminate the element of time and uncertainty. And Steve really is great. He focuses right in on that point. And again, he's got great help from Conrad here, who did do a pretty good job of writing this. And one of the things he shows, Conrad shows, and Steve brings out in his essay, is again, the similarity between the various supporters of authority in the book. They're all fat. Now, not that there's anything wrong with that, I say from a personal perspective, but there's this amazing laziness to the Home Secretary in Britain, to the communist revolutionary in the book. And these are all people who are living off the fat of the land, if you will. It's a very good book about bringing out the parasitic nature of government. And Conrad really focuses in on the attitude of especially left-wing intellectuals, that the world owes them money, it owes them a job, they're smarter, and therefore they should get more benefits out of society. And I find the same thing in my essay on H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, which I analyze first as Wells's critique of the invisible hand idea. I think that's kind of the undercurrent of the work, but after showing that Wells's critique of capitalism fails, I go through and show how at the same time Wells in many ways portrays himself as this invisible man character who's disaffected, revolutionary, again, thinks the world owes him a living, does not like the way the market rewards intellectuals, and so comes up with this scheme of invisibility, which he chiefly uses to take money from the rich and give it to himself. Actually, not even give it to the poor. So again, a couple of the essays deal with this issue of the biases of the left-wing intellectuals and the left-wing artists. One of the things that I understood as I began to analyze The Invisible Man, there's a marvelous moment in the story when the Invisible Man disappears from Wells himself. It's an odd narrative moment, but he says, what the Invisible Man did that afternoon, nobody knows. This isn't a novel where he's been tracing his movements all along. And that gave me an insight that bears on this issue of why so many authors are biased towards socialism. And that is that authors are themselves central planners. That is, by and large, they are used to being in control of the world. And they like a world that is neatly plotted out. And they think that's the way the world should operate. That one person should think out the whole of a little world, and that's what it is to create a novel or a play. And that helps explain why when novelists try to think about the real world, they think it needs an author, which is to say a socialist government. They're not happy with the messiness, the contingency of free markets. This comes out particularly in the genre of utopia, which is at the same time a novel and a form of socialism, almost always. That is, the people who write utopian novels are trying to give you a simple plan, simple design by which to run the whole world. And I think this actually goes a long way to explaining why so many authors have been socialists. The reverse of this is an interesting development in the field of Slavics. One of the few areas where you will find any literary critics who are anti-Marxist is Slavic departments. Undoubtedly because they follow the Soviet Union and other Marxist regimes more closely than people in other fields. And there's a great critic named Gary Saul Morson, who's written a book, Narrative and Freedom, The Shadows of Time, which I discuss in the first chapter in the book. And he argues that particularly Tolstoy and Dostoevsky deliberately created novels in which they, as authors, were no longer in control. Now, I know that sounds absurd at first, but what he's talking about is the fact that as Dostoevsky and Tolstoy wrote their novels, they allowed their characters a certain freedom. They allowed their characters to surprise them. And Morson has shown that if you look at the notebooks of either author, they'll basically say, I was going to have this guy marry that woman, but I realized it wouldn't work out, and he'd marry someone else. And Morson makes a very powerful argument. Again, the book's called Narrative and Freedom, that this was a major attempt to find a new literary form that would accommodate freedom, contingency, and creativity. And he talks about the interesting fact that both Dostoevsky and Tolstoy worked in the field of serialized novels, the way Dickens did, for example. That is, these novels would come out periodically, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, And the interesting thing is that in the case of Tolstoy, he deliberately said, I'm just going to publish this thing serially, see what happens. I don't know where War and Peace is going to end. I don't know where Anna Karenina is going to end. I'm going to see what happens, and I'm never going to change it. Whatever happens, happens. And Morrison argues that this created a very powerful new form of literature. I think many people would say that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are the greatest novelists ever, and he argues this is one of the reasons. And here's a new literary form which evolves over time, which embodies an element of time and contingency, just as Austrian economics says economic activity does. And that led me, the first chapter is largely about the serialized novel. I discussed Dickens mainly, and this was, in fact, the subject of my Mises lecture, now much expanded in this chapter. And it's there that I was able to go after this negative attitude towards commerce that is so prevalent among my colleagues. The 19th century novel was a very commercial form of publishing. People like Dickens made a fortune of money, and the 19th century novel was a major element in British commerce. And that leads most of my colleagues who write on this subject to complain about this form and to complain how authors like Dickens were corrupted by the commercial nature of publishing. This would be one example, let's say, might be Great Expectations. What we have in the novel as we know it is famously a second ending, a second thought about the ending. I won't exactly say it ends happily now, but Dickens had originally written a sadder ending and then was persuaded, actually by a fellow novelist, Bulwer Lytton, to create a scene in which Pip and Estella would get together. And people have complained about that as a happy ending, a Hollywood ending. And again, I think one can argue on both sides of this issue. But in general, what you find is people arguing that the publication system in 19th century Britain imposed limits, constraints on authors, made them write at a certain pace. Again, these novels were typically brought out in weekly installments or monthly numbers. There are lots of cases on records of authors being told to finish up their novel quick because we're coming to the 20th installment, and we do have novelists complaining about that sort of thing. And in general, when you read a number of these Marxist critics of the Victorian novel, they present it as if the publishers were in charge and they were telling the authors what to write and telling people what to read. And so this becomes an image of everything that's wrong with capitalism in the Marxist view. And in particular, it's this famous notion that you can sell anything, that capitalism is an example of you produce worthless goods and then you foist them off on an ignorant and unsuspecting public by virtue of clever advertising. And it's really quite amazing to read Marxist analyses. I cite some of them in this first essay, where literature is presented as the very opposite of an expression of freedom and creativity. It's presented as this commodified system. One of the interesting aspects of it is it's all ex post facto reasoning. Critics will look at what sold, which novels were big successes, and conclude that that was a formula that publishers were imposing. Even though no one ever predicted any of these things ahead of time. And that's what I go through using some pretty serious studies of how the Victorian novel actually operated, and show that, on the contrary, it actually was a form of spontaneous order, an example of how markets operate at their best, in which you basically had a feedback and correction mechanism in which authors would plan out novels ahead of time. They'd sketch in what they thought the plot was going to be, already, I would say, anticipating what the public wanted, and therefore incorporating a kind of proleptic feedback in that sense. But in any case, they would start publishing and then see how the audience reacted. And it's just like soap operas today on television. If a character increased ratings, in this case, you'd pump up the role of that character in the book. And if you were writing some character that you as an author may have loved, but sales were going down, that character got hit by a train in the next installment. And again, this exaggerates a bit the degree of feedback, but there's no question that this is what was going on, that it was a case of a market phenomenon where authors were trying to give the public what it wanted, and in the process, I argue, largely improving their work. And it is interesting that for all the complaints about the vulgarity of commercial literature, the Victorian public largely selected out what we now think of as the greatest novelist. Dickens was by far the most popular novelist of his day, and everyone would acknowledge that among British novelists of the 19th century, he was artistically the best. It's not as if the public was choosing the worst novels, and by and large, the novels that have survived are the ones that were successful with the public. There's an Italian critic, Franco Moretti, I also discuss in the chapter, who calls himself a Marxist, but he's a market Marxist. He basically has done studies showing the way in which success in the marketplace actually tracks aesthetic value. It's done some remarkable work in that field that I cite in the chapter. So this is the other way in which we try to reverse these Marxist analysis of literature and try to show that, in fact, the conditions of commercial publication in 19th century Britain, they were imperfect. In many ways, they did produce complaints from the authors, but those that worked within the system actually found that it put them in touch with their audience. And that's really, I think, where the vitality of the Victorian novel comes from. I think it's where the vitality of much of the popular culture in our day comes from. And so, in fact, the publishers acted as middlemen in this system. The authors were largely writing on their own. The audience was free to buy books or rent them. Actually, books were rented in the 19th century the way DVDs are now, because they were relatively expensive at the beginning of the century. And the authors generally, the publishers, served as the key link-up, anticipating what demand might be, steering authors sometimes in the right direction. In short, the Marxist view is that the publication process is entirely negative. It's hegemonic, as they like to say. It imprisons authors and the public. Instead, I try to show it opens up pathways of communication. And I discovered the work of Robert Darnton, the great French historian, and he had done wonderful studies of just this subject with regard to some of the great publishing projects in 18th century France, and especially the French encyclopedia. And he, in a kind of historical detail that I don't have the patience to uncover, did wonderful studies of how French publishers basically used their network of selling agents to go around France, find out what people wanted to read, report back, and help steer authors in that direction. So it really turns Marxism on its head in that sense, showing that capitalism actually solved the great problem of how to create a mass literature, typically through creating modes of mass distribution of literature. As I like to put it, for decades, Marxist literary critics have been trying to denigrate writers by showing how they were implicated in capitalist systems, that their books somehow were involved in commercial enterprises. In fact, this shouldn't have been lowering the authors in the minds of these critics. It should have been elevating capitalism. They actually were uncovering whole areas in which they could show that capitalism was participating in the production of culture, but they hate capitalism so much they couldn't recognize that. It is true there have been some very positive trends in what's called cultural studies, where critics who are sympathetic to popular culture have begun to understand the principle of consumer sovereignty. Again, the whole principle of Marxist analysis of literature, especially the famous Frankfurt School, which in many ways dominated cultural studies for much of the second half of the 20th century. The principle there was summed up in the phrase of Horkheimer and Adorno, the culture industry. That they were particularly interested in Hollywood and how it manufactures mass entertainment, which it imposes on the public. The one thing they never bothered to do was study the public. And see how the public was reacting. There's been a new sort of fan-based form of cultural studies, which studies the actual reaction of audiences for TV shows, and shows that in fact they're not these passive consumers that the Frankfurt School claimed. People have been able to analyze the letters that soap opera fans send to the producers of the show and other such forms. And it's very interesting to see that, again, it's a feedback loop. And suggestions from the fans have changed the course of a series that gives then a creative role even to the fan. And there have been a whole bunch of studies. A man named Henry Jenkins, who used to be at MIT and I think is now at USC, has done wonderful studies, particularly of Star Trek fans in this regard. And I try to do something similar in discussing the Victorian novel in this first chapter. And I think that is an area where maybe we can make some common cause with one strand of cultural studies. As I try to point out to those people, what they need to do is learn some Austrian economics. They're discovering the principle of the sovereignty of the consumer, which is utterly incomprehensible to them within their Marxist framework. If they just read some Austrian economics, they'd see there's actually a good theoretical basis for what they're doing. So broadly speaking, this we put spontaneous order in the subtitle because that idea from Hayek unites a number of the essays. Many of them study the phenomenon of spontaneous order. Tom Peiser's essay on Whitman shows that Whitman's celebration of American democracy was a kind of bottom-up vision of America, celebrating its people and not its government, celebrating the energies, the market energies of America. A number of our essays basically look at how literature portrays spontaneous order. At the same time, we try to show how literature is produced by spontaneous order. Again, my study in the book of 19th century publication basically argues that that's the nature. It's why culture is so unpredictable, and why after the fact these Marxists can explain why a book succeeded, but they can never predict it ahead of time. And finally, we do examine the issue of literary form itself in a number of the essays, and try to show that literature itself often takes a form of order that looks messy on the surface, that has a lot of loose ends, but underneath there's a deeper structure that we would call spontaneous order. Again, Morson's study of the Russian novel does a very good job of showing that. We've been trying to broaden the notion of literary form without overturning the traditional notion. That is to say, our image of literary order is basically that of a lyric poem. of a beautifully written 42-line lyric by Yeats or T.S. Eliot that is absolute literary perfection, that is created by a single author and that totally fulfills his vision, and in which famously every word is necessary. This is the old ideal of the new criticism that I was brought up on, and so many people have been brought up on, an ideal of literary perfection where no word could be omitted from the poem, and it still be the same poem, and no word could be added to it. One famous reflection of it is that in the movie Amadeus, where the ideal of Mozart's music, every note is perfect. Salieri is the speech, remove one note and it would be chaos and so on. And that's a great ideal, and some works of literature, some works of art approach it, but War and Peace, remove one word and it falls to pieces? I'm sorry, no. And in fact, there are many studies where they discover in the process of printing the book, they lost a word or two. Actually, there's some guys written a whole book about this, that authors, they see their novel, they're proofreading it, they forget somebody left out a whole sentence, somebody left out a whole chapter, it's still a great book. And that's one of the things I try to do in this opening theoretical chapter on, I call it the poetics of spontaneous order, that there is a form of order that is not perfection. And that is the great lesson about the economic order from the point of view of Austrian economics, that the market isn't perfect, and above all, it's not an image of static perfection. What the market is a continually self-correcting mechanism. It is a feedback loop. It is never perfect, but it's always perfecting itself. It's always moving towards a better state and trying to eliminate problems. And as we know from economics, the huge problem with socialism is it thinks that some form of static economic perfection is possible. And even neoclassical economics shares that view, and all this notion of market failure and equilibrium and how we need to second guess the market. All of that has its equivalent, I figured out, in literary criticism when you uphold a model of literary form that's really an abstraction. One line from Human Action that began to resonate in my mind as I worked on this, and I think I can quote it correctly, is the living is not perfect because it is subject to change. The dead is not perfect because it does not live. And that's one of the many profound lines in the 800 pages of Human Action. And that's what I began to realize I was stumbling upon here, was the phenomenon that literature could be structured and have form without having a kind of static perfection, without having been perfectly planned out by a single mind ahead of time. One of the problems with literary critics is that they are Monday morning quarterbacks. They are analyzing works after they have been created. And indeed, I would say the function of the literary critic is to try to find the structure or the plan of the work. The problem comes when you assume that that plan was fully articulated by the author before the work came into being. I would say that the notion of literary perfection is what Kant would call a regulative ideal, or we might call a heuristic device. We should always be thinking that a work of literature is perfect and that it perfectly coheres, that everything falls into place. That's the best guideline for analyzing it, because it will make us think carefully about it. But literary works are in reality like sausages, and maybe you don't want to know how they were made. Sometimes if you know how they're made, you'll think they must be a mess. So it's useful to think, okay, they're perfect, but don't assume that because you've been able to find a pattern in it, that the author necessarily had that in mind. It may be possible. Again, I don't wish to deny, especially when you look at some of the great lyric poetry written, that this thing was perfectly planned out ahead of time. But when you study the history of the creation of literature, you find lots of elements of contingency, things that just came along. It's one of the things that Morrison shows about Dostoevsky, for example, that he would work from newspaper incidents. And sometimes you will see something will happen in one of his novels that's based on a newspaper incident that occurred months or sometimes a year after Dostoevsky started writing the novel. And a major turn in the novel occurs not because of his initial plan, but because of something he experienced, sometimes something he saw in the world later. And Morrison thinks Dostoevsky is a greater writer for just that reason. And this is one of the things I try to open up in the opening chapter of the work, this sense that literature is process, not product. Yes, ultimately you have a product in front of you. You have a book, and we tend to think of it, therefore, as this single artifact created in a single, all-seeing act of creation. But in fact, if you study something like the serialized novel, you see that these great works by Dickens, by Tolstoy, by Dostoevsky were created over long periods of time in a process where in many ways the work was continually being reshaped in the author's own mind, and partially as a result of feedback from the audience. That makes creativity a much messier process, a more contingent process. Some ways it doesn't suit the minds of academics who want everything perfectly laid out and frozen for all eternity. It's why they've always liked Latin as a language, not any of these living languages. But it's encouraging to me that there are a number of critics who've been turning in this direction and seeing that literature itself is a product of what we would call spontaneous order. You can even say, using Hayek's formula, that literature is the product of human action, but not of human design, in the sense that when you look at the history of one of these great 19th century novels, at every moment human beings were creating these novels, but the whole process was not designed in advance. And the final product, the novel that emerges, is very different, let's say, from what Dickens imagined it to be at the beginning. And we have lots of detailed information to show that. His novel, The Old Curiosity Shop, he didn't even start it out as a novel. He was creating, he thought, a new magazine, but the story of one character, Little Nell, fascinated the audience so much and boosted sales to an unprecedented level that he said, I'm going to write a novel about this. And the result is we've got The Old Curiosity Shop. So, as I say, we've tried to use the principles of Austrian economics here to open up new perspectives on literature, show that it can celebrate the market and spontaneous order. It can be seen as the product of the market and spontaneous order. And above all, that many literary works take a form that's analogous to what we think of as spontaneous order. So we hope we've opened up a new frontier. It is true that many of the Marxists have had to retreat to literary studies, having been refuted in the economic world, but we're going to go after them there as well and maybe open up some new perspectives on literature in the process. So, thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. We've got some time. Yes?
Do you think that Dickens' reputation for dislike of colors?
Absolutely not. Dickens did not like industrialism, but for example, he was a powerful advocate of free trade. In Household Words, the journal he edited in the 1850s, one editorial after another in praise of free trade. Many ways he was a Manchester liberal. He was himself a businessman. One of the biggest projects of his life this is very Victorian, it was a Reclaiming Fallen Women project. He devoted a lot of his life to this, and the kind of institution he created was designed to introduce women to entrepreneurship and get them to be able to become productive citizens. So people have mistaken that critique of industrialism in hard times for the whole of Dickens' opinion. If you look at him more deeply, he has a lot of affinities with Manchester liberalism. And the editorials on free trade are just extraordinarily good. Yes. Well, Mario Vargas Llosa would be the most prominent one. Before he was a presidential candidate in Peru, he actually was a rather good novelist. Now, if you want to see an author who appreciates capitalism and absolutely pillories left-wing schemes, read Vargas Llosa. He was well read in Hayek and cites Hayek. And in particular, his greatest novel is something called War of the End of the World, which is about various forms of millennial schemes to change Brazil in the 19th century. But he is probably the most self-consciously pro-capitalist author I can think of alive today. Yes?
Have you done any reading in Garrett?
I have not, unfortunately. I mean to do so, but sometimes I can't read Yuri.
I remember that term was done in the Institute, who was discussing Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky right now became kind of an object of the cultural wars in say, Russia today. It's claimed by libertarians, it's claimed by ultra-nationalists, by fascists,
Well, I was very impressed by this work of Gary Saul Morson. Again, it's called Narrative and Freedom, and he argues that freedom is the central value in Dostoevsky and that he set out to find a way to liberate his own characters from authorial tyranny. And give them their freedom to make their choices themselves. And Morson, and again, I defer to his knowledge. He's read the books in Russian, for example, and is actually very anti-Marxist in his attitudes. And so I wish I could claim I'd arrived at this independently, but he makes a very powerful argument in this book that for both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, freedom is the central value, and that characters define themselves by their acts of freedom. And that's why both as novelists tried to avoid the situation where they mapped out ahead of time what their characters were going to do. Yes? Oh, yes, she's one of the central figures in it. North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell is a remarkably pro-capitalist work. Interestingly enough, it was serialized in Dickens' own journal roughly at the time of Hard Times, and they were in competition, and Dickens was a little upset that Gaskell was so pro-capitalist in that work. Gaskell had come to Manchester and at first hated it. She came from kind of Jane Austen country, but she came to understand Manchester. She came to appreciate it, and above all, she has scenes in that book which is set in Manchester, in the very heart of industrial England, where women are sort of whistling on their way to the factory and happy coming home. And she points out that the alternative to this was domestic servitude. And that when they worked in a household, they were subject to all sorts of problems and basically were working for room and board and not for pay, and that Factories represented freedom for them, where they could just get paid for their work, go home, leave the job behind them, and spend the money the way they wanted. So here it's quite remarkable, a woman novelist who is celebrating not just capitalism, but industrial capitalism. I should also say that Elizabeth Gaskell is the central example of the chapter. This is a kind of morbid joke, I guess. The last time I discussed it in the Mises lecture, and people laugh, but I will say that Elizabeth Gaskell's masterwork for many people is a novel called Wives and Daughters, and unfortunately she died before she could finish it. Please don't laugh, because the last time I mentioned people did. But that's a key example for me, because here's a novel which people like Henry James have called her best novel, and it's only 85% complete. She did not live to write the last 2 chapters. Moreover, she never got to revise it at all. So there's several contradictions in it. She gets the political affiliation of one character. It's Tory at one point, Whig at another. So there are things that are imperfect about this novel, including the fact that it lacks an ending. Yet it's a great novel. I offer as my example of the sort of 85% complete novel. Well, that's good enough. You can read it. No one puts that book down and says, "Oh, I wasted my time. The thing's not complete." You can pretty much infer how the plot's going to end from what was written. And so that's a really interesting example from a theoretical point of view. Here's a novel that is manifestly imperfect in the sense of incomplete. Yet many people call it her best novel. It has a kind of perfection that is not the perfection of the perfectly crafted lyric poem. Aristotle would have a problem because he says a work must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. This actually lacks an end, and yet it is sufficiently complete so that you can, in effect, infer the deeper structure from what we have in it. It's still a great novel. So yeah, Elizabeth Gaskell is there. Yes. What about it? I love it. I mean, oh, well, there's nothing in this book, but one of the interesting things about The Lord of the Rings is it is a kind of, let me say, medieval critique of the modern nation state. I mean, if I were a libertarian trying to make something with it, I would say that Tolkien, being a medievalist, offers you a defense of the old medieval notion of the liberties, and that the ring is the nation state, the one ring to rule them all. And the great horror in Tolkien is of central power. And I think his own experience of World War I in the 20th century led him to see the most demonic force in the world is the all-encompassing, all-destroying modern nation state. It's a kind of reactionary critique of modernity. In that sense, I'm sure Tolkien was not a libertarian, but there are libertarian lessons that can be learned from it. The need for local government, for example. In a weird way, that book is a celebration of the Shire. Leave it alone. You can only destroy it by this great power with all its armies and its machines trying to take it over. So again, it's not in this book, but maybe someday I'll write an essay on it. Yes?
How overtly do you have this discussion about Austrian economics in the classroom directly, and with what students do you do?
Okay, I do not do that. I must say that I have a problem with my colleagues when they're preaching Marxism in the classroom, and so I do not try to introduce Austrian economics directly. Students ask me about it. I point them in the direction of Mises and Hayek, but I try to avoid being as polemical I feel students, they take an English course, they should be studying English literature. I do things, I try to shake them up. Gaskell is one of the examples I use, showing here's a woman in favor of capitalism for what it does for women. I try to point that out to them. It's incredible trying to get a simple idea that through their skulls. I cannot believe that there could be anything good about capitalism, but I at least try to plant the seed. Yes. Not much, to tell you the truth, though I cite him in the Thomas Mann essay. I mean, There's some clever ideas in Baudrillard, but like so many French theorists, he could say it's simpler, and it's not all that profound sometimes when you reduce it to what it really is. But he was a heck of a good photographer, it turns out. Yes.
In Gilligan Unbound, you treated globalization with these different television shows.
Yeah.
Of course, that ended with the X-Files. Would you say that you have anything to say about modern television and what it says about our continued reflection of our notion of globalization?
Yeah, I just published an essay called The Truth is Still Out There, The X-Files and 9/11. I wrote an essay, The Un-American Gothic, on fear of invasion, American popular culture. I've continued to work on, I got 2 essays on Deadwood coming out. I mean, I continue to work on popular culture, but I don't want to take up too much time on that. I'm pretending to be a literary critic for today. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the influence of H.L. Mencken, who was, as you mentioned, Conrad, a great scholar, critic, and very influential, and his literary criticism is really wonderful. But he's also known for his loathing and contempt for the businessman as a type, and the Chamber of Commerce, and Babbittry, and all of that kind of thing. And that whether you think that the prejudice of the literateurs against business and capitalism is very much a reflection of his enormous influence in the teens and 20s.
Well, I think it's a great failing on his part. I was actually very inspired by Mencken in my teens, reading things by him. I think Mencken reflects deeper trends that directly influence all these other people. In other words, it's not as if he turned around the world where literateurs were all pro-capitalist. I mean, you see those attitudes in John Ruskin and Matthew Arnold. This is so deeply embedded in the English intellectuals that I think, although Mencken is an example of this, I don't think he really is a historical force in producing it. It predates him by at least 100 years. Okay, one last question. Yes.
What about
Well, they're all very interesting, and I said. Well, again, I think they didn't like it. Now, Trollope is an interesting figure because for example, he hated the serial novel system, and so secretly he would write the novel out and then pretend he was producing it in installments. But I don't know, and of course, in Trollope's case, he didn't like America because it was too commercial. I mean, in many ways, these English authors suffer from the aristocratic heritage in England. As I point out, this contempt for commerce is fundamentally an aristocratic contempt. It begins in England really as a right-wing and reactionary phenomenon. But fortunately, Gaskell would be the best example of an English novelist who appreciated commerce, but she had to fight her way through it. But again, unfortunately, as I began with, the majority of authors do not show an appreciation of commerce or capitalism. How often do you ever see a sympathetic portrayal of a businessman or businesswoman in a 19th century novel? It's ironic that all these people were business people themselves, and nothing in the history of the world, nothing ever did more for women as a cultural force than the 19th century British novel. It's the first field that was open to them, and in which they came to the fore and triumphed. And this is, again, I cannot get this through to my students, that it is 19th century capitalism that made George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, the Bronte sisters possible. And it really was a case where there was Dickens was not a feminist, but he saw that Elizabeth Gaskell sold books. So he turned the pages of his journal over to her. He saw that she was potential competition, so he decided to get her writing for him. And it's a perfect example of that great lesson that capitalism overcomes prejudice. That you would have to pay, if you were somehow a misogynist or anti-feminist as a publisher in the 19th century, you were going to pay a huge price for it, and they didn't pay it. Instead, they published women in unprecedented numbers. There's no cultural field in which women ever achieved as much as the 19th century novel. It was their first great breakthrough form, and it was a triumph of British commerce and British capitalism. Good place to end, right? Thank you. Oh, yes, this is another.
Dr. Cantor has agreed to sign books downstairs in the bookstore using his Mises Institute pen. Did we give you one of those? Okay, I'll work on that. And so he'll be downstairs. And now, to close out the conference, I'd like to introduce Doug French, who has been a great champion of this very expensive for us conference. And I think he probably sat down with Joe Salerno and I for, 47 different times going through the schedule, every 3 days over the last several months. So he's been involved in every detail and has been a real trooper through this whole thing. The president of the Mises Institute, Douglas French.
Well, of course, Jeff said everything I wanted to say. You may have noticed when you walked in some books on a table downstairs, a little book called Inclined to Liberty. And if you haven't picked one up, please do. The author has graciously donated them to this conference, as he does to all of our conferences around the country when we do Mises Circles. The author's in the room. He helped us in funding this conference, and if he would stand, Mr. Lou Carabini. Before I let you stampede Martha's Buffet to the north, I want to talk a little bit about this room, because if you were here last year, it seated quite a few less than this. We had walls that were there, and there were book stacks in the back. And by the way, if you haven't been up to the third floor, please make the trek and take a look and be amazed. But it's been quite a project, quite an undertaking to move things around, move walls around. And thankfully, we have someone who works here who does the books, but she's not satisfied doing the books. She likes to do other things and draw pictures and be a contractor. And she's the person who really made a full court press to get this building done and in shape and ready for this week. She's not here right now, but please recognize Norma Willick for her work in getting the building done. Of course, Norma couldn't do her work if we didn't have a sponsor for the project. And it's a guy who does so much for us. And he's here, hopefully in the room. I do see him. He's our favorite pipe pusher from Pasco, Washington, Mr. Jim Wolf. Please stand. Well, Jeff already mentioned him, but another round of applause, please, for our conference director, Mr. Joe Salerno. And of course, Joe got plenty of help from the guy who is really the mainspring for Institute progress, I think, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. And of course, lots of staff are involved. I won't name them all, but I think all of you interface with Pat Barnett and Christy Holmes and Chad Parrish, who's right up there. Will Seitz down in the down in the bookstore who's going to sell you a copy of Mr. Cantor's book so that he can sign it for you here in a little bit. Someone I wanted to mention who doesn't get recognized a lot, but all the printed material that's around, the schedules and everything, is done by Kathy White. And that sounds like no big deal, except this schedule is a moving target like you can't imagine. So we constantly go to Kathy and say, oh, you got to change it. Well, I just changed it a few minutes. Well, you got to change it again. So anyway, Kathy White is not here, but she certainly deserves recognition. Just a word about the conference. I can't imagine the Keynesians or the Marxists have the breadth that this conference would have. Imagine, we've talked about money, we've talked about business cycle theory, but sociology, law, ethics, history, religion, literature, and rap music. Does it get any wider than that? If you can't relate to people, to the cause of liberty and economic education in a free market with that repertoire, then, well, there's probably no hope. But I think there is plenty of hope. And actually, the people in this room are the hope. It's your ideas and the work that you do that is going to make the world a better place. So please keep doing that for us, and see you next year, March 10th through the 12th. Good night.